I've got to say, I live in the wonderful city of Melbourne, but by God, Victoria is a mess. The Andrews government has been forced to divide the city down to 36 suburbs who are basically the COVID outcasts and the rest of the state. And the reason for the divide is all about the government's failure to manage hotel quarantine. Now the news that a Sydney man who spent 2 weeks in hotel quarantine in Melbourne was allowed to return to New South Wales and to work in a very busy inner-city supermarket despite having returned a positive test while in quarantine. But apparently that's all within the rules.
There's a standard set of release from isolation criteria that is agreed upon nationally. This man met that criteria and then stayed for another 2 days on top of having met the release from isolation criteria because he was still in hotel quarantine. He would have been released from any hotel quarantine in the country based on that criteria.
And let's not forget that is the medical official who doesn't know her Captain Cook from her Arthur Phillip. All right, so my feedback question today on Facebook was this: should Victoria's border be closed to ensure other states don't go backwards? And here's what you have had to say. Judith Thompson says, close off the greater city of Melbourne, allow rural towns get back to business. Mark Kelly believes, yes, I think it's time to close them. The Victorian government has a lot to answer for and their incompetence is going to cost lives. David Starr thinks, no, open up everything. If you're vulnerable or in fear, stay home and self-isolate. Heather Turner says, I don't think closing the borders is the answer, but better controls definitely needed. The law needs to be applied evenly to all. And Ian Gorton says Victoria had the chance to send Andrews packing last year and didn't do so. No sympathy from us north of the Murray. Sky News contributor Jane Marwick joins me now from Perth. I'm intrigued for your thoughts here. Jane, you're watching from the safe and very COVID-free state of WA. What do you make of it all?
Look, I've got a lot of sympathy for the people of Victoria, and in a lot of ways I would like to know if Western Australia could have come close to something like this too, Peter, because I have a sneaking suspicion that we might have had some security guards guarding returned overseas travellers, and we might have got away with this by sheer dumb luck. Yet we're really lucky in WA, no evidence of community transfer. We seem to be COVID-free. And last weekend I was able to travel around this state. And I've got to be very honest with you, it almost feels as though we're complacent here. So listening to those, looking at those comments from people, I wonder how many of them are from Victoria or other states. It has been an absolute disaster. Watching that unfold has been, I mean, the stories of security guards sharing lifts, cigarettes, beds with the people they were meant to be keeping safe and away from everybody else. The fact that you've got them people with COVID heading to New South Wales and the Northern Territory. But I'm a West Australian in my bubble, the imposed bubble. There are problems with that. I'd like to ask you, as a Victorian, what do you think should happen? People are saying the whole of Victoria should be shut down, the whole of Melbourne. Certainly you wouldn't think the whole of Victoria because people in the regions are as remote from this as we are in Western Australia. But what are your views on what should happen in Melbourne?
Oh, I certainly would be trying to keep rural Victoria up and going, regional Victoria. They have very few COVID cases, in fact, almost no community transmission. I don't know how effectively you can do that, close off the outer suburbs of Melbourne from the regional areas of Victoria, but that's something that should be on the plate. I go back to the start. The only reason we are in the position we are, Jane, is we are an island continent, and the federal government, rather than disparate states with all their various rules, the federal government has sole responsibility for the borders, and they shut them down. Where we have the risk point ongoing from the national border shutdown is these returning Australians, pockets predominantly into New South Wales and into Victoria. They're the two entry points most people have been coming back into. So both governments have got to sit down and table and say, well, that was our great risk point. New South Wales learned after Ruby Princess to put it in the hands of the police. And Victoria, and this will be the scandal, I bet, for what reason did they go with private contractors? At what point did they know the system was unravelling? There's been a myriad, it's coming out in these press conferences, a myriad of stages along the way where they knew it was falling apart. And why were they allowing these private contractors to then go home into their own communities and backwards and forwards? That in itself put away all the bad behaviour to one side, but that in itself was a big risk problem. And so I think this is a massive failure of the Victorian government and health officials and the police minister as well.
As do I, and probably the health minister too. I think we heard that there were some lines of demarcation within the Victorian ministry between the police and the health minister with regards to calling in the ADF and people giving up some of their patch. What we can see is, and I think you and I talked about this, the federal government was quick to close the border with China and then slow to close our borders, but we caught up and we've got the terrific ability to do contact tracing. So I agree with you. I think it is an abject failing from Victoria, and there are so many questions that need to be answered. But the thing that gets me as a West Australian, we have all the freedoms here. It doesn't feel like there's no difference to us now, really and truly, but we can't fly overseas or interstate unless we want to do 2 weeks quarantine. But the thing that gets me as a West Australian looking at you in Victoria is you've all suffered such privations. Your lockdowns were so firm, so hard, over the top, I thought, and yet this government decision means that you are all now paying a terrible price, and perhaps the rest of the country pays that price too. And that, to me, is the nub of it, the politics and the nub of it.
And this is one of the biggest economies in the country, the Victorian economy. Yeah. If it does not get back on its feet, it slows down the rest of the recovery. And of course, come September, the government's got some tough decisions about the welfare it's paying people. You got 40% of the electorate right around the country basically supported by taxpayer welfare. That will be the cliff we're headed for unless something changes dramatically. I want to talk about federal redistributions. There's one on its way. The impacts will fall predominantly in the electorates in Victoria and the electorates in Western Australia. This decision by the AEC Commissioner, his name is Tom Rogers, will see Victoria's membership or entitlement to seats in the House of Representatives move from 38 to 39, so Victoria will gain a seat. Western Australia will go down a seat. It'll go down from 16 to 15. Now, given you only just picked up a seat a couple of years ago, 2016, you will lose a seat. I want to know how that's going to be accepted by the people of WA. It doesn't mean the seat of Burt, which was the gained seat in 2016, will disappear because all the boundaries are subject to change. Yeah. But it does mean WA goes backwards.
Yeah, and it's disappointing, but we see this ebb and flow from time to time, and it's a sign, Peter, that during the boom our population was booming, and while our population hasn't decreased in raw numbers, what you're seeing, I think, is there are more people. Victoria's population has increased at a greater percent than Western Australia's increased. Look, it's extremely disappointing for us, and here we are in our secessionist bubble at the moment, but as a West Australian, we often feel that we are ignored by the East Coast, and this won't sit well with West Australians, but these are the rules by which we play. It's based on numbers, and we have to accept it.
Yeah, and it comes down to one vote, one value. You need electorates to basically reflect a certain amount of people.
You do.
Correct. Otherwise, you don't want a distortion where someone, their vote is worth more in a particular seat. That's the reason for it. What's all this talk about Matthias Cormann? I saw it, it's been speculated quietly for some time, but it appeared in print today. Phil Curry in the Australian Financial Review had the story that he's likely to depart. He's pretty emphatic, actually, Curry, in the article, that Matthias Cormann will leave come the budget in October. I'll remind people he's been the finance minister. He's been in that role since the government was elected in 2013. And the difference, and I hope I'm not telling people what they don't know, but the difference between the finance minister and the treasurer is the treasurer brings in the money, sets tax rates, concerned about the revenue. The finance minister, I think, if you care about where your taxpayer dollars go, is probably the most important role in government bar the Prime Minister, because he allocates the spending. He reins in the spending, he gets rid of the waste, and he allocates where our priorities are over what's called the forward estimates, which is the budget cycle going forward. So he will be a big loss if he goes. What are you hearing, Jane?
Yeah, look, I don't know any more than what is being reported, Peter. He'll be an enormous loss to WA. But look, we thought there were rumours that you and I both heard with regard to the last election, and that if the coalition didn't win, that Senator Cormann would vacate his seat. Those rumours were around, and he may well have decided to come back with that Scott Morrison win just for a short time. I think, look, you know this. The travel, okay, with COVID there hasn't been as much travel, but the travel, he's got a young family, it is exhausting. He's highly regarded within the business community because he has been such a success, and I, for one, would like to thank him for helping us save Mora College, a little regional school for kids from stations so they can board and go to school close to their families. He was absolutely brilliant on the level of detail like that. But I would imagine he'd had some things lined up. He's highly regarded in the corporate world. The travel is exhausting. Why wouldn't you?
Look, he's a young man. I don't think he's even. I think he's in his mid-40s, and he's got a big brain. And I think he'll be a huge loss if he does go. I regard him very, very highly. I've got to ask you another question here, because this has struck me as something. Well, I bang on about my concern about the internet going into homes and the risk it is to children. I'm not saying I'm a Luddite. I like the internet, but I think we've got to wake up that there are also all these distractions that it brings in terms of mental health for young people. A big study, it looked at Australian high school students. It's a world first, and it's saying that all the screen time triggers a biological reaction in young people, potentially causing them lifelong issues, stunted emotional growth. Now, you've got to wonder, at the same time we've had the internet, almost concomitantly we've had these mental health issues and suicide growing exponentially with young people. How much, you and I have talked about this, it's been lovely to slow down in this COVID period, Jane. How much do you think coming out of this that we're going to be much more rigorous about how devices de-socialise you? It takes away more than it adds. And will we be mindful of that, do you think, going forward?
I'd love to think we would, but human behaviour is human behaviour. This study is very, very worrying. 2,800 students studied in years 8 to 11. What the authors say is, yes, they're emotionally stunted. In fact, they're teenagers who are so stunted, particularly the online gaming, they're so stunted that they behave like toddlers. I would say, and they say schools have got to monitor this. Well, so do parents. I understand they're saying schools be careful about how much homework you give children that they have to use the internet for. It's a fascinating study and people should read it. I would love to say, and I had a sort of digital-free weekend when I went down south and got out into the bush, and I feel the better for it. I would love to say that people are going to give the internet its rightful place, which isn't at the dinner table and everywhere with you. But I reckon parents use it as a babysitter. I'm not damning parents, but parents get busy. I think we'll get back into our old habits, bad habits, pretty quickly. And I can tell you, I've been watching West Australians, Peter, who don't have the privations that you do in Victoria, and the old behaviours, including a lack of social distancing, return very quickly.
That is fascinating, Jane. It is fascinating. I'd like to think we'll all change. We probably won't. Thanks very much, as always, for your time on a Friday night.